This image is forever etched in our minds. A vast white patch at the very top of the globe, a symbol of pristine purity and eternal Arctic ice. It seems as though this space is completely isolated from human ambitions. But this ice can lie. If you listen closely to the howling wind over the tundra, you can make out a low-frequency hum. Behind the immaculate white facade lies a story not of exploration, but of brutal survival.
A story of constant struggle, technological hubris, and hidden fear.
Foundations cracked by the frost, toxic waste slowly creeping toward the ocean, titanic radars scanning outer space. What we see on the maps is not just an island. It is an incredibly complex military engineering mechanism, a gigantic testing ground for doomsday scenarios, an instrument of global domination forcibly implanted into the glacier. By the end of this journey, you will understand the true nature of these colossal structures.
You will see why trillions of dollars are being burned to maintain this wasteland.
And you will realize that these bases are not relics of the past. Right now, they are preparing for a war of an entirely new kind. But to grasp the scale, we must go back to that starting point when there were no radars or concrete here, only the polar night, the biting wind, and the lifeless earth. Greenland's geography has always been extremely hostile to humans. A vast ice dome surrounded by a narrow strip of frozen rock. Storms rage here in the summer. In the winter, temperatures drop to critical levels. No one in their right mind would build large settlements here. But World War II changed the very concept of global space. The United States needed a secure air bridge to Europe. The shortest route lay directly over the Arctic ice.
Greenland suddenly transformed from a geopolitical backwater into a major strategic stronghold.
The first expeditions of military engineers landed on the coast in complete isolation. They dug into the permafrost with pickaxes and explosives. They had neither the right equipment nor experience working in such temperatures. Steel became as brittle as glass, and the oil in the engines froze. Despite the chaos, runways were carved out of the rocks at an incredible pace. Soldiers lived in flimsy metal barracks that were drafty to the core. Every ton of cargo was delivered across the ocean at great risk to life. This was not a construction project, but a continuous battle for survival. For the first time, the U.S. Army faced an enemy that could not be shot. The cold killed slowly, seeping under clothing and breaking the spirit. People lost limbs to frostbite and went mad from the polar night. But the mission was accomplished at any cost. By the end of the war, Greenland was covered with a network of airfields and weather stations. They facilitated the deployment of thousands of aircraft for bombing missions against Germany. An illusion was created that man had conquered the harsh nature of the North. It seemed that after the victory, these temporary bases would simply be abandoned.
They had served their purpose and no longer had any use.
The military began packing up to return to the normal world. No one suspected that this was merely a prelude. Stone and ice began reclaiming their territory as soon as the engines fell silent. Nature quickly destroyed the abandoned wooden towers and temporary hangars. Snow covered the straight lines of the runways, erasing all traces of human presence. But this silence did not last long. A new, far more terrifying threat was already taking shape on the radars of the world's capitals. Greenland was about to become a shield in a war capable of destroying the entire planet. The Iron Curtain had descended on Europe, redrawing the map of influence. Washington quickly realized that the shortest route for Soviet bombers lay through the North Pole. Strategic geometry ruthlessly pointed to Greenland. It became the main line of defense for the North American continent. The temporary bases from the previous war were no longer sufficient. A permanent, invulnerable infrastructure capable of withstanding a nuclear strike was needed. The Pentagon launched a top-secret project codenamed Blue Jay. The goal was to create the largest airbase north of the Arctic Circle.
Thule, a settlement in the northwest of the island, was chosen as the site for the new facility.
It was one of the coldest and most inaccessible places on the planet. In winter, the bay froze solid, cutting the base off from the outside world for months on end. Building here defied all laws of engineering logic. The logistical operation was on a scale reminiscent of the Normandy landings. In the summer of 1951, a veritable armada of ships broke through the ice of Baffin Bay. They brought tens of thousands of workers, heavy equipment, and millions of tons of building materials. Work proceeded around the clock under the conditions of the polar day. Engineers faced the phenomenon of permafrost, which destroyed any conventional foundation. Heat from the buildings melted the ice beneath them, turning the ground into a sticky swamp. Structures sank, snapped in half, and sank into the ground. New construction principles had to be invented on the fly. The solution was paradoxical and technologically complex. They began to raise the buildings on piles, leaving an air gap to cool the ground. Pipelines were laid on high supports so they wouldn't touch the surface. The base began to resemble an alien city on metal legs. People worked themselves to the bone, choking on the icy wind. The metal burned their hands even through thick gloves. Equipment broke down, rubber cracked, and fuel turned to jelly.
Every pile driven into the ground required an incredible effort and cost the Treasury a fortune.
But ambition drove the project forward, despite the monstrous costs. By fall, Thule Air Base had taken on its cyclopean form. It became a symbol of power, capable of hosting heavy strategic bombers. From the outside, this steel city seemed like an indestructible outpost of the free world. The Americans believed they had managed to rein in the Arctic chaos, but the ice knows how to wait. Thule Air Base quickly turned into a veritable military metropolis at the edge of the Earth. More than 10,000 soldiers, technicians, and scientists were stationed there at any given time. Inside the hangars, sterile order reigned, while jazz played in the barracks. It was an oasis of American comfort, surrounded by absolute emptiness. But maintaining this comfort required the constant burning of resources. Ships and planes delivered thousands of tons of fuel, food, and equipment daily. The base's power system consumed diesel fuel in staggering quantities. The logistical lifeline connecting Thule to the mainland was far too vulnerable. Command demanded complete control over the airspace. Dozens of auxiliary radar stations began to spring up around the main base. They spread across the entire ice sheet, like the nerve endings of a giant organism.
Each one was a small fortress battling nature.
The people at these remote outposts lived in conditions of extreme isolation. In winter, they went months without seeing the sun. The psychological pressure of the confined space drove many new recruits mad. They called it Arctic fever, a state where the silence begins to physically weigh on the brain. The equipment couldn't withstand the constant strain either. Antennas broke under the weight of frozen ice and hurricane-force winds. Sensitive electronics failed due to temperature fluctuations and magnetic storms. Engineers had to risk their lives daily to restore communication. Despite the difficulties, the system continued to expand. Radars beamed invisible waves through the stratosphere, scanning for Soviet missiles. The instrument of power grew in stature, becoming increasingly complex. The military believed they were in control of the situation on the ground. But a new threat was emerging from the very object they were protecting. The bulky stations were perfect targets against the white backdrop. Spy satellites could easily detect any movement on the ice. External might turned into obvious tactical vulnerability. They needed to find cover that didn't exist on the surface. The answer lay right beneath their feet, in the many kilometers of eternal ice.
The Pentagon made a crazy decision. They had to burrow deep into the glacier.
Thus began preparations for the boldest and most absurd experiment of the Cold War. The body of the system had to change shape and hide in the darkness. The idea of hiding military infrastructure under the ice seemed brilliant in its simplicity. The glacier provided natural protection against radiation and blast waves. It concealed the facilities from aircraft and early reconnaissance satellites. A project to create an underwater base called Camp Century was launched. Engineers brought giant Swiss rotary snowplows to the glacier. They began cutting deep, wide trenches into the dense fern. It was like the work of a surgical scalpel cutting into the white flesh of Greenland. The machinery dumped tons of snow, forming perfect geometric corridors. These trenches were covered from above with corrugated steel arches. The arches were then buried in snow again, hiding the base from prying eyes. Inside, long artificial caves were formed, protected from hurricanes. Residential modules, laboratories, and warehouses began to be brought into these tunnels. But the main problem lay in powering this subglacial city. Diesel fuel was incredibly expensive and left a thermal signature. The engineers took an unprecedented risk. They delivered the world's first portable nuclear reactor to the camp. Assembling the reactor in the ice was a technological marvel of its time. A controlled chain reaction was initiated in a deep bunker. The atomic heart began pumping energy and heat through the veins of the icy city. The base achieved complete self-sufficiency and could survive for months without resupply. Camp Century was presented to the public as a peaceful research center. Magazines printed beautiful photos of smiling soldiers in warm tunnels. They drank coffee, played pool, and read newspapers beneath the thick ice. It was the perfect showcase of American technological superiority. But the camp's true purpose was classified as top secret. It was a testing ground for Project Iceworm. The Pentagon planned to cut thousands of kilometers of tunnels throughout Greenland. Special trains were to constantly run through these tunnels. Their platforms would carry hundreds of intercontinental ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads. It was a concept of an invulnerable weapon of retaliation, hidden within an icy labyrinth. The system was poised for incredible expansion. The military believed that the glacier would be the ideal, compliant repository for their arsenal. They were gravely mistaken about the nature of the material. In the early years, the subglacial city functioned flawlessly. The reactor delivered steady power, and the tunnels were lit by bright lamps. Scientists drilled into the ice, studying climate history, while the military tested the rails. It seemed that the perfect symbiosis of man and ice had finally been found. But this stability was merely a temporary lull before the storm. Engineers treated the glacier as a static, solid rock. They calculated loads as if they were drilling tunnels through granite. However, the Greenland ice sheet has a completely different physical nature. A glacier is a living, slowly flowing river of colossal mass. Under its own incredible weight, it plastically deforms and moves toward the ocean. The trenches dug by humans became wounds on the body of this river, and the glacier began methodically to close these wounds. At first, the changes were barely noticeable. The tunnel walls began to gradually close in, narrowing the passageway. Then the deformation accelerated, creating terrifying pressure on the steel ceilings. Nature began to crush the base with ruthless, mathematical precision. The soldiers had to chip away at the ice on the walls every day with chainsaws and pickaxes. It turned into an endless Sisyphean task. As soon as they removed one layer, the glacier would advance again immediately. The stress in the steel structures grew, and the metal began to creak menacingly. It became clear that the mass would not maintain the project's ideal geometry. No rails could remain straight in the shifting ice. The tunnels would inevitably warp, trapping the trains carrying nuclear missiles inside. The grand plan for a mobile base was crumbling before their eyes. The reactor also found itself in a critical danger zone. The ice was pressing against the walls of the nuclear compartment, threatening to breach the integrity of the cooling circuits. Continued operation could lead to a radiation accident right inside the glacier. What had been conceived as a shield had turned into a trap. The military had to admit defeat in the face of a force of planetary scale. In 1964, the nuclear reactor was shut down and dismantled with great difficulty. The core was removed, but radioactive liquids and thousands of gallons of chemicals remained. It was decided to evacuate the base and leave it to be torn apart by the ice. Engineers were certain that the glacier would forever bury the camp under hundreds of meters of snow. It was a convenient illusion that allowed them to forget about the toxic legacy. After the closure of the subglacial projects, the focus shifted back to the surface. The Pentagon no longer attempted to hide weapons within the island's body. The instrument of power shifted its function from active strike to global warning. Greenland became a giant early warning radar. Colossal antennas for the early warning system sprang up near Thule Air Base. These monolithic arrays, the size of a football field, faced north. They were designed to detect Soviet missiles within the first minutes after launch. The system demanded incredible precision and absolute structural stability. But Greenland's nature once again put the technology to the test. Winter storms battered the radars at speeds exceeding 300 kilometers per hour. Winds of such force didn't just blow, they lashed like a concrete slab. The steel supports vibrated, threatening to rip the multi-ton structures out of the permafrost. Engineers had to use aerospace materials to reinforce the antennas. The protective, radio-transparent domes concealing the rotating dishes became masterpieces of engineering. They withstood direct hits from chunks of ice and extreme wind pressure. The facility was building up its physical armor. However, the weak point of this system was not in the steel, but in the people. Cold War tensions were reaching their historic peak. Radar operators stared at green screens for hours, waiting for the apocalypse to begin. Any flock of geese or magnetic anomaly could trigger a nuclear alert. The base lived in a state of permanent paranoia and combat readiness. The airspace was constantly patrolled by strategic bombers carrying thermonuclear weapons. Operation Chrome Dome ensured that some of the aircraft were always in the air. These massive machines circled over the icy wasteland like vultures. Their routes took them over the harshest and most inhospitable regions of the Arctic. The slightest technical error by the crew meant certain death. The planes were regularly refueled in midair, teetering on the brink of disaster. The system was overwhelmed by its own scale and lethal potential. Too many nuclear warheads were in constant motion over an unpredictable ice sheet. The probability of failure grew with every hour of patrol. The physical limit was reached in the freezing January of 1968. The illusion of absolute control over the weapons was shattered. The tragedy occurred a few kilometers from Thule Air Base. A fire broke out aboard a patrol bomber, quickly destroying the control systems. The crew was forced to eject, abandoning the doomed aircraft in the darkness of the polar night. The plane crashed directly onto the solid ice of North Star Bay. The impact was of monstrous force. The detonation of conventional explosives in 4 hydrogen bombs tore apart their casings. There was no nuclear explosion, but tons of plutonium and uranium were scattered across the area. Burning jet fuel melted through the ice, sending some of the debris to the bottom. What the Camp Century engineers had so feared had happened on the surface. The secret, pristine ice shield was deeply contaminated with radiation. A panicked and unprecedented cleanup operation began. Thousands of people in protective suits crawled across the ice in 40-degree below-zero temperatures. They shoveled radioactive snow and packed it into steel barrels. The wind constantly carried invisible death, complicating the already hellish work. Equipment sank into icy holes, breaking down from the cold and radiation. This operation revealed the futility of attempts to tame the Arctic. Most of the contaminated snow was successfully collected and shipped to the mainland. But one of the uranium cores was never found among the twisted metal. It remained forever at the bottom of Baffin Bay. The facility suffered an irreparable blow, which had to be concealed from the global public. The disaster triggered a major political crisis in Denmark, which owned Greenland. The Danish government officially banned nuclear weapons on its territory. The Americans had to lie and make excuses to maintain their strategic positions. The cost of keeping the base came to be measured not only in dollars but also in trust. After the accident, the constant patrols of heavy bombers over the island were canceled. The military realized that the risk of the system's self-destruction outweighed the benefits of deterrence. The radars continued to operate in automatic mode. The base sank into electronic silence. The infrastructure stood still in anticipation. People hoped that the worst was behind them and that the ice would conceal their mistakes. But they forgot that ice is not eternal. With the end of the Cold War, the need for massive arsenals disappeared. The world had changed, and it seemed that the Greenland bases would become mere monuments to a bygone era. The number of personnel at Thule Air Base was reduced several times over. The empty barracks were closed and the equipment was mothballed. But closing the base entirely proved impossible. The early warning radars became part of a more complex global electronic network. Now they monitored not only bombers, but also satellites in orbit. The facility turned into a giant server processing terabytes of digital information. The old analog antennas were dismantled. In their place rose the smooth geometric domes of modern phased arrays. Inside them, there were no moving parts, only millions of microchips and wires. The system had transitioned from crude mechanics to quantum precision. Maintaining this high-tech network required a completely different approach to infrastructure. The sensitive electronics needed ideal temperature conditions and a stable power supply. The old diesel generators were replaced by sophisticated power plants. The cost of operating every square meter of the base rose rapidly. During this period, the facility existed, as it were, outside the public eye. It was not featured in news reports. It had vanished from geopolitical briefings. The illusion of calm was absolute. Cables reliably transmitted data to command centers in Colorado. But the physical structure of the base continued to deteriorate under the effects of time. The concrete supports poured back in the 1950s began to be covered with a network of deep cracks. The steel trusses were being corroded by the humid sea air. Modernization focused solely on the electronics, leaving the foundations to rot. Engineers patched the holes with cosmetic repairs, trying to postpone the inevitable. They reinforced the fasteners and poured new layers of cement over the old. It was a classic rescue attempt that only weighed down the structure. The system continued to function at the limits of its hidden capabilities. The radars looked into space, ignoring what was happening beneath their foundations. And beneath them, a process was beginning that could not be stopped by steel or budgets. Global climate change hit the Arctic harder than any other region. At the start of the new millennium, temperatures on the island began to rise irreversibly. The permafrost, which for half a century had served as solid concrete for American bases, began to soften. The cryogenic shell turned into an unstable, shifting slush of mud and water. The foundation upon which the might of a superpower rested was literally melting. The piles of the radar stations began to sink, disrupting the precise geometry of the antennas. The slightest deviation of the dome led to distortion of the signal sent into space. Engineers had to install powerful refrigeration units directly into the ground. They attempted to artificially freeze the ground beneath the buildings, consuming megawatts of energy. But nature dealt a blow not only to modern structures. The glacier began to give back what it had taken many decades ago. The abandoned camp century, which had been considered buried forever, began to loom menacingly close to the surface. The layer of snow above it thinned with every hot summer. Scientists sounded the alarm after calculating the rate at which the ice sheet was melting. It became clear that the toxic waste left behind in the 1960s would soon be set free. Thousands of gallons of radioactive water and chemicals could spill into the ocean. What had been hidden for safety's sake had turned into an environmental time bomb. Saving this ghost town would require billions in investment and unique technologies. Retrieving the barrels from the bottom of a melting glacier is practically impossible. The Pentagon found itself trapped by its own past decisions. The price of the engineers' overconfidence in the past has fallen on the shoulders of today's environmentalists. The destruction of the infrastructure coincided with a sharp change in the political landscape. The melting ice opened up new sea routes in the north and access to rare earth metals. The Arctic ceased to be an impassable barrier and turned into a thoroughfare. Russia began restoring its polar bases, and China declared itself an interested party. Greenland once again became an arena of fierce competition among the great powers. But now the United States found itself in this arena with a dilapidated, crumbling infrastructure. The old instruments of control required a radical overhaul. Half measures no longer worked. A complete system reboot was needed to maintain geopolitical dominance. Today we are witnessing an unprecedented process of pouring trillions into melting ice. Thule Base, recently renamed Patuxent, is undergoing the most extensive reconstruction in its history. Old hangars are being demolished, making way for high-tech monoliths. Construction is once again proceeding at a frantic pace. The new architecture must account for the planet's changing physics. The buildings are equipped with highly complex hydraulic systems capable of leveling the structure as the ground settles. Foundations extend dozens of meters deep into the bedrock. These are no longer temporary camps, but massive, anchor-like fortresses. The base's electronic infrastructure is fully integrated into the U.S. Space Force. Modern sensors are capable of tracking hypersonic missiles flying along unpredictable trajectories. The base coordinates the operations of satellite constellations, controlling drones on other continents. It is the nerve center of global digital warfare. But the more complex the system becomes, the greater its vulnerability. The undersea cable trunk lines connecting Patuxent to the mainland can be easily cut. Communication satellites can be blinded by lasers or shot down. the base risks finding itself once again in complete, blind isolation. Today's personnel are not soldiers with rifles, but system administrators and cryptographers. They stare at monitors while physically situated on the edge of a melting continent. The tension has shifted from the physical to the mental. The cost of the slightest error in an algorithm could be the lives of millions of people. The instrument of power has reached the peak of its evolution. Greenlandic bases no longer defend borders in the classical sense. They ensure superiority in cyberspace and outer space. This is a weapon that must activate seconds before the start of open conflict. But the load on this facility continues to grow exponentially. The climate is destroying the physical shell faster than engineers can repair it. Geopolitical adversaries are closing in, testing the system's limits. The Greenland shield is overloaded. It is cracking at the seams, trying to perform functions incompatible with the realities of nature. Look once more at this white wasteland, at these smooth radar domes rising above the black cliffs against the backdrop of the northern lights. On the surface, everything looks monumental, static, and safe. It seems that human genius has finally tamed the cruelty of Arctic nature. But you already know that this is an illusion. Behind every ton of concrete lies the fear of losing control of the situation. Every upgrade only complicates the system, making it even more fragile in the face of unforeseen disasters. A tool created to ensure safety has become a hostage to its own mass and complexity. What we see is not a triumph of engineering, but a desperate attempt to cling to a melting foundation. Billions of dollars are frozen in the ice every year just so that radars can stare into the void. The bases in Greenland have long ceased to be merely military installations. They have turned into a living monument to technological hubris. Power and ambition have their physical limits, and here at the edge of the Earth, they are felt more keenly than anywhere else. A massive machine prepares for scenarios that it itself provokes. The lights in the command center's windows continue to burn around the clock. The system keeps running, but the ice beneath it will never be the same again.